Get Back, Let It Be, Film Analysis. This is my 5th video about the Beatles movies. This one will be an analysis of the Let It Be and Get Back documentaries, comparing and contrasting them with each other. Unlike the previous 4 videos I have made about the Beatles films, this one will be largely free from occult references. Let's set the scene. After the White Album, it was obvious that the Beatles as a unit was beginning to publicly lose its cohesion. John was inseparable from his handler wife Yoko, and also using heroin. George was involved in the production of other acts at Apple. Ringo was considering film projects. Billy, in the public role of Paul, was the only member of the Beatles that wanted to pull together and push forward. The official narrative tells us that Billy, as Paul, was the source of the idea to unify the band by returning to live performances, since this was the activity that first drew them together. According to Barry Miles in the Beatles Diary Volume 1, Billy, as Paul, told the press in October of 1968 that the band would soon play a live show for a subsequent TV broadcast. The band booked the Roundhouse Theatre in North London for the 12th to the 23rd of December 1968, and the claim was made that the Beatles would perform there at least once during that time. However, this plan did not come to fruition. Billy's ideas of touring again were vehemently opposed by John and George. A compromise was found in the form of the Beatles making a 1-hour TV show, perhaps filmed at the Roundhouse Theatre. The scope of the project first grew hyperbolically and then later collapsed into reality. Mark Lewison, in his complete Beatles Chronicle, tells us that firstly, they changed the planned venue from the Roundhouse Theatre to a Thames-size flour mill. When that idea was jettisoned, they replaced it with a proposal of playing on board a ship. The next suggestion was playing on a stage in the middle of the Sahara Desert. Finally, none of those ideas were considered to be grandiose enough, and a Roman amphitheatre in North Africa was contemplated, with the band performing to an empty venue at dawn. As the sun rose, the venue would then fill up with an audience made up of people from every race, colour and creed. However, history tells us that none of these romantic dreams actually happened. Fundamentally, no one, except maybe Billy, was very enthusiastic for the work involved. While the Beatles were still deciding on a venue and a plan of action, Dennis O'Dell, the then head of Apple Films, suggested that the band at least start rehearsing at the Twickenham Film Studios before returning to any kind of public performance. He had already booked the studio space there because he was about to shoot The Magic Christian in February of 1969, featuring Ringo alongside Peter Sellers. So, on the 2nd of January 1969, the Beatles started to rehearse at Twickenham. Dennis O'Dell was also the one who suggested that they film their rehearsals on 16mm tape and then use the footage to produce a half-hour Beatles at Work TV documentary to accompany any concert performance that would subsequently take place. Michael Lindsay Hogg had agreed to direct the project, having already worked with the band on some of their promotional films. Originally, the project was entitled Get Back, as in the Beatles get back to playing live. Later on, this was changed to Let It Be. The first half of the project was spent in the Twickenham Film Studios. They spent their time there either mucking about, playing old songs, or falling out with each other. On the 10th of January 1969, George left the band because he felt overlooked by Billy and John. He felt like neither his work nor his opinions mattered to the band. After coaxing him back, the Beatles agreed to move to their Apple offices and to build a studio and work from there. The setup of their basement studios at Apple is a clumsy affair, but eventually they start to record there. Billy Preston joins the group, which lifts everyone's spirits, but they continue to waste much of their studio time as they did before. Eventually, with every other option lost because of their lack of discipline, they decide to play on their own rooftop, since no other venue could have been booked at such short notice. This now legendary concert was their last live performance together. The original Let It Be film gives the audience the impression that the concert was cut short by the arrival of the police. By the time the Let It Be film was given cinema release, the Beatles had just broken up. The film almost certainly reminded the band members of the tension that had grown between them, and nobody wanted to be reminded of it. The film also stood as a testimony against the mythology of the Beatles being the superband of the 60s that they were meant to be, since it showed that they had completely failed to live up to the expectations placed upon them. Naturally then, the footage from this time sat in a vault for over 50 years until Peter Jackson took up the task to restore the footage and make a longer and more rounded documentary about that period. At the beginning of the Get Back documentary, we are presented with this information. The Get Back project in January 1969 produced over 60 hours of film footage and more than 150 hours of audio recordings. Numerous editorial choices had to be made during the production of these films. Scenes that contain audio-only material have been supplemented with representative pictures. And it then goes on to say that many editorial decisions had to be made throughout the Get Back documentary. When the Get Back documentary was released in November 2021, like most people, when I was first presented with this information, I was highly suspicious that 60 hours of film footage and 150 hours of audio recordings seemed to have been magicked into existence. My first response was to assume that the footage had been generated artificially, either by using CGI or deepfake technology. However, 2.5 years later, and having spent some time looking into Sora AI and Topaz Labs, I've watched a lot of videos of ordinary people taking home movies and photographs that were 30, 40, even 50 years old and transforming them into high definition using this kind of technology. So the 60 hours of footage seems a little bit more plausible. However, I do still have my reservations, and I will discuss that later in this video. I also have a bootleg copy of the Nagra tapes, which is the 90 hours worth of audio that the film crew recorded for their own purposes during the original Get Back project. I suppose if you were to combine all of those hours with the hours of audio that was recorded by Glenn Johns and George Martin, it probably would amount to 150 hours of audio. So after that previous bit of information, we're then told this. This footage contains explicit language, mature themes, and smoking. Viewer discretion is advised. I've watched quite a lot of other people's reviews of the Get Back documentary, and one of the things that comes up is the issue with smoking. So in the documentary, we see them smoking and drinking in the studio and being quite reckless, including putting lit cigarettes balanced on the end of a piano or attached to the loose guitar string coming off of the headstock of their guitar. And I think some people thought that there's no way that that would be possible, that no one would behave like that. It was also interesting to note that none of them were British. And I can tell you, as a British person, I found that entirely plausible. Because I remember as a small child that everybody smoked everywhere. Not only could they smoke everywhere, they did smoke everywhere. And in fact, it wasn't until the 1987 King's Cross fire disaster that health and safety standards, which affected where you could smoke, were actually changed. And the only reason that that one fire in particular mattered so very much is that it was a calamity upon calamity. That building had no smoke detectors, it had no fire marshals, nobody knew what to do, nobody took responsibility. And in the end, it took 150 firefighters and 30 fire trucks to put that fire out. And that's why it had such an effect on public policy and law in Britain. And now you can't smoke anywhere. So although to a modern audience the behaviour of the Beatles seems incredibly reckless, it's absolutely genuine. People could and did smoke absolutely everywhere in Britain back in 1969. After all of that advisory information, we get an introductory montage of clips and newsreels telling us the backstory of the Beatles. When they get to 1968 and they start to talk about the Yellow Submarine animation, we get this image. In a film that was almost an hour and a half long, they chose this image, the one that has the two Pauls. And I can't help but feel that that was not an accident. At the end of the montage sequence, the subject turns to why the Beatles stopped touring in 1966. Famously, they did have some scary moments in places like Manila. But this was not the true reason why they ceased to be a live act. They could not tour anymore because Paul had been killed and Billy had not been playing him long enough to successfully play him publicly. I have always wondered whether these terrifying moments for the Beatles, whilst they were on tour, were engineered deliberately to give the official narrative a reasonable excuse for why the Beatles stopped touring. After the opening montage scenes, we are shown a calendar of January 1969, which is when the original documentary took place. This was supposedly when the Let It Be album was produced, but actually it took much, much longer. This is my version of their calendar. All of the dates shown in red are the dates that the Beatles actually went into the studio to do some work, although on many of them they weren't very productive. But you can see that there are actually 21 dates where they went into the studio, so theoretically they should have got a lot done, perhaps more than they did. The first scene of the actual fly-on-the-wall footage is this one at Twickenham Film Studios, where we are told the Beatles face a daunting task. They must write and rehearse 14 new songs and perform them live 2 weeks from now. Why is that? Because it's never really explained to us. Do bands normally impose 2-week deadlines upon themselves to write 14 songs for a new album or live performance? Do they have a contractual obligation to meet, and they've only left themselves a fortnight to play with? Or are they just conjuring up a deadline to create a false sense of jeopardy? Because otherwise it seems really bizarre. One of the reoccurring ideas that comes up is the idea that Yoko's presence was very disruptive to the Beatles when they were working on this album. But I think it's equally true to say that everybody else brought outsiders into that working studio environment. Here we are on day one, and George Harrison brought in one of his Hare Krishna friends, who is sitting in the corner. So by this point, Billy turns up, and he's an hour and a half late, because he insisted upon using public transportation, although we are not told this in the film. The only thing they achieve on this day is a rehearsal of the song Two of Us, which has not been finished yet. Previously, they were unaware that they were being recorded, but by this point they are, and they become a little bit more tense in their behaviour. One of the things we're shown is this. We see the whole of this piece of paper, and they pan down the screen, and we can see the lyrics from the song Two of Us. And then at the bottom, it says a Quarryman original. I don't know why it says that, because this handwriting is clearly Billy's. Billy is not Paul. We can tell from the directors' names written at the bottom of the paper that this is Apple Company paper. So it can't have been written by the real Paul, because the Apple Company wasn't founded when he was alive. Also, we know from the Memoirs of Billy Shears that The Two of Us is written as a sort of conversation between himself and Paul. That's who the two of us are. So I think Billy is perhaps having a little fun with us, because this would bring it back in line with the mythology that John and Paul wrote 100 songs before they were famous, when clearly they didn't. So having got basically not very much done on the first day, they come back. It's now Friday, the 3rd of January. This clip that we see of Billy noodling at the piano is actually the first bit of footage of the Beatles that we see in the original Let It Be film. So they give the impression that that is day 1, but it's actually day 2 of filming. As Billy is playing Tea for Two, we see Ringo tap dancing. Apparently he did take some lessons as a child, but this is never explained in the film. Billy plays a selection of different pieces of music, including a section of Barber's Adagio for strings. This is very interesting because, one, I doubt the real Paul McCartney could have played that or would want to have played that. And secondly, Barber's Adagio for strings was originally conceived as a funeral piece for a friend. So, perhaps that's a sly PID reference all by itself. As the other Beatles turn up for work, George is leafing through a copy of the Beatles Monthly, and he is reading out some sections from that magazine, including an advert for The True Story of the Beatles, which was written by Billy Shepherd. I don't know if that particular Billy Shepherd is the same Billy who is playing Paul, or whether it's a different person. But either way, it's a reference to Billy Shears, or Billy Shepherd, who is playing Paul. Then we get this information. With an urgent need for new material, the Beatles reconsider some of their earliest songs. And this is where they start to work on One After 909. This, of course, means that on day 2, they've already abandoned the idea of writing 14 new songs, because they're reaching back into their archive. We then see this very interesting section where Billy is talking about the times when Paul and John would sag off from school, play truant, and go to Paul's house. And he talks about the fabled writing of 100 songs before they were famous, that he admits most of which weren't very good, but still we get this number, 100 songs. It's also interesting to note that in the original Let It Be documentary, we have the same conversation with completely different footage. This is a still shot of the same scene, but taken from the original Let It Be movie. And obviously this is taken from a bootleg, because this film hasn't been available on any kind of home media since the early 80s. So it looks pretty grainy. In the original Let It Be movie, when we see this scene, we get a close-up of Billy, we see him talking, and the movements of his mouth match what he's saying. So it's kind of weird that they didn't reuse this footage in the Get Back documentary, particularly because this same scene with different audio is used for the footage of the Get Back documentary, but for the next day, and we'll see that in a moment. When they're working on Don't Let Me Down, John and George point out that if they're ever going to play this song live, they would really need to have a pianist. And a few names are discussed, and Billy Preston's is one of them. They, of course, knew him from Hamburg, as we get told on the screen here. Billy Preston became friendly with the Beatles while they were performing in Hamburg. I'm glad that they mention it, because in the original Let It Be film, he literally just suddenly turns up, and it is not explained whatsoever what he's doing there. It's still weird that he's there, because they mention him and then the next day, suddenly, he's there. And I don't believe that that was an accident. I believe some phone calls were made, because they realised that they needed to inject somebody else into the mix to really raise the spirits of the band, because they were seriously flagging at that point. The weekend passes, and here we are on Monday, the 6th of January. So Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday have passed 4 days, and they have achieved basically nothing. Here we have the scene where they are discussing again the 100 songs that Paul and John wrote before they were famous, and you can see how clear the footage is. The AI is just so very good, it's incredibly impressive. To me, the audio is actually even more impressive, because if you've ever listened to the Nagra tapes, the audio recordings that were made by the film crew, you'll know how very ropey they sound and very quiet. We are told that George loans his 8-track recorder to the band to use in their makeshift control room. I've always found this incredibly weird. Why is the most successful band of all time having to do this? Why are they having to make do with makeshift control rooms? It's like nobody knows what the hell they're doing. During the scene where the equipment is being brought in, they also discuss their finances. And it's just incredible that even though, as they put it, they're not just EMI artists, they're the EMI artists that are bringing in all the money and propping up every other EMI artist. And yet, when they want to do things, creatively speaking, there's never any money. No one seems to want to help them. And I found that incredibly telling. It makes me wonder if the deep state money that was funding them was drying up at this point. Or that maybe the deep state considered the Beatles psyop was basically done. We also are introduced to Magic Alex for the first time, who obviously turns out to be a giant con man, promising to create a control room that never materializes. So on this day, the band work on Don't Let Me Down and Two of Us. And when they're working on Don't Let Me Down, George points out that they're basically doing the same old stuff over and over, and the lyrics are corny, particularly in the backing lyrics that he and Billy are singing. Billy also notes that they seem to be going round in circles. Then George points out that we've only run through 4 songs and haven't really learnt any yet. And even Billy admits that, well, we've only got 12 days to do it, so we really need to get on with it. There just seems to be more and more tension building in the group. Then there's a legendary, quite tense discussion that's had between Billy and George. Billy says, "You always get annoyed when I say that." To which George replies, "You don't annoy me anymore." The word anymore is doing a lot of work in that sentence. And I find it utterly fascinating, because at what point did the real Paul McCartney annoy George Harrison, his good friend from school that he went hitchhiking across the UK with, that he went on holiday with, even before they were in the Beatles? Even in the memoirs of Billy Shears, we're invited to think about how hard the death of Paul was for John, but we're never invited to think about how hard it was on George, or how difficult it was for George and Billy to get along. Later on, the group have another discussion about the future of the project, and again it's getting quite tense. Billy gets up and he starts to pace around because he says he can't do this on camera. "I'm scared of me being the boss," he says, "and I have been for the last couple of years." This is a very telling moment, because even though they're trying to keep the facade going, the truth keeps bubbling up to the surface. As a band of musicians, they have obvious problems. Billy is a trained musician, a session musician, and the others play by ear. They just cannot see eye to eye over a way to work together. Billy's skill set as a musician and his ability to read music is incredibly obvious to me as someone who also has those skills. I cannot understand why other people can't see it, especially from other trained musicians. It's also worth mentioning that after this scene, the camera pans around the band 180 degrees, and I don't remember seeing any dollies to put the cameras on, so I don't know how they achieved this. Perhaps it was with the use of AI. So now it's Tuesday the 7th of January. They still haven't got very much done by this point. Whilst talking to the crew, Billy uses his posh English Vivian Stanshall voice to talk to them, and then he starts to work on what will become the Get Back single. This is one of the few times in this documentary that we actually see a song taken from its inception all the way through to the end. From the point of view of it just being a documentary, that to me is one of the most interesting aspects, and I don't know why, in the original film, that more wasn't made out of that. In the original brief, the TV special was only meant to be a half-hour documentary about the Beatles at work. So why didn't they just make it a documentary about the making of the Get Back single and its B-side, Don't Let Me Down? They could have shown the working of Get Back and all of the working out towards its B-side, Don't Let Me Down, and that would have been much more interesting and considerably less depressing. But they didn't do that. And one suspects that, knowing that the Beatles were breaking up by the time it was released, that they wanted to show some of why that happened. Next, we have a conversation that involves the crew as well as the band. They're talking about where to do the show, and Billy, as Paul, says something quite prescient. We should do the show in a place we're not allowed to do it. You know, like we should trespass, go in, set up, and then get moved, and that should be the show. He then gives a suggestion of maybe going into the Houses of Parliament and being removed by the police still playing their guitars. He then adds, scuffling with the coppers, boots and truncheons and all of that. Given how the original Let It Be documentary does end, I can't help but wonder if the ending was actually engineered. Whether or not they actually planned to have the police come in, or whether they knew that just by disturbing the peace that the police would naturally turn up. Either way they got it, and either way it allowed them to have a much more interesting rock and roll ending to that film than it really deserved. They discuss other places to do the concert, including a hospital for children or an orphanage. They then discuss what their motivation is for doing the show. Billy says it can't be for the money, so what's it for? Which is interesting, considering the conversation they had earlier about money. John says he wants to smile at an audience again, in the same way that they did when they did the TV broadcast for All You Need Is Love. And then he says, well, the worst that we have is a documentary of us making an LP. Well, no, not really, because they didn't actually finish it. The worst they had was a documentary of the Beatles mucking about for about a month and not getting very much done, which totally destroyed, to me anyway, the myth of the Beatles as a supergroup. Obviously, the Beatles felt the same way, and that's why the footage of this documentary sat in a vault for 50 years. Actually, I'm very surprised that it was ever released in the first place. They then have a few more tense moments. Billy points out that every time they get together, they only talk about the fucking past. We're like old age pensioners. Remember the days when we used to rock? And then he reiterates the fact that he doesn't feel like he has support. Billy says that if this is how the project is going to go, that it should be the last one for them as a group. George says we need to be creative and not in the doldrums. And then John says the Beatles have been in the doldrums for at least a year, pointing back to the period where Paul has been killed and Billy has replaced him. Then they talk about the fact that they've been very negative since Brian Epstein passed away. And it's interesting how this is frequently used as a sort of cover. Brian's death was definitely a sad event for the group because, one, they liked him and considered him a friend, but two, he gave the band, as an actual performing act, some sense of discipline. But really, they're upset because Paul has died, Billy has come in, he has replaced him, he is a totally different kind of person. And being a Beatle is no longer fun anymore. And Brian's death is often used as a cover for the real source of their sadness, which is the fact that Paul is gone. Billy then talks about ending the band, and George responds with, "Maybe we should have a divorce." At the end of all these heated words, Billy turns to Michael Lindsay Hogg and says, "Any other director in the world would say, 'Fuck off, you know. Fucking get off my set, you cunt.' You know they would, wouldn't they? If suddenly in the middle of a thing I was trying to pull together, four people just sort of shout, 'Oh, I don't think we want to do it,' you'd go, 'Oh, fuck off.' Anybody. I mean, I couldn't operate with that." To which Michael Lindsay Hogg simply replies, "It's true." I've just read that from the Get Back book that came out with the documentary, and that was transcribed from the original Nagra tapes. It's interesting to note that that conversation was not had in either the original film nor the Get Back documentary, because, let's be honest, that language is a little bit too real, a bit too raw, and definitely too much for Disney+. Michael Lindsay Hogg then steps in. He says, "Well, obviously it's kind of sad if you break up. I don't really want you to break up. Maybe I'll just leave you to it, play a little bit together, go for lunch, and basically chill out." So, having had this quite serious, quite depressing conversation, what do they play? They play Maxwell's Silver Hammer. And when I watched this, I thought, "Billy, why are you so insensitive? The last thing that they want to play is this. In this moment. Play it later. Why are you playing it now?" The most depressing and upsetting thing they could possibly have played. It's interesting, in the original Let It Be documentary, they look so incredibly depressed when they play this song. In the Get Back documentary, they don't look happy, but they definitely look less depressed. That particular edit was obviously an attempt to make this scene seem less desperate than it really was. They look like they're all ready to walk out on Billy in the original documentary. Particularly Ringo, actually, who really looks like he does not want to be there. So that was interesting. So they go and have lunch, and they come back. Mal Evans has brought an anvil and a hammer, and then they go round and round singing Maxwell's Silver Hammer some more, which obviously doesn't really improve the spirits of the band. And then John mercifully moves them on to Across the Universe, and then they play rock and roll music, and we see the footage of them playing the same song at the Budokan in Tokyo. And it's interesting because they include the shot where George is not playing and he's waving to the audience. So they're miming. And I kind of took that as a sign, maybe, that some miming is going to come up in this documentary too. It was a curious choice of footage. I think one of the reasons why they start playing so many old tunes is that when they play old songs, they stop being miserable. Like, the nostalgia really cheers them up as a group, even if it's only momentary. So that's the end of that day. They still got very little done. We're now on to Wednesday the 8th of January, and George and Ringo and Michael Lindsay Hogg, they're the first in the studio, and they talk about what they watched last night on the TV. And we have this fantastic reference to a show called Out of the Unknown, and specifically the episode called Immortality Inc. Annoyingly, you can't watch this because this TV show was lost in the Great Purge at the BBC, where a great many fantastic shows were permanently lost. I don't think it's a conspiracy that this TV show is not available anymore. I just think it's a classic case of BBC ineptitude. But anyway, it's originally based on a novel by Robert Sheckley. In the original novel, there's a company called Rex Industries. They're in 2110. They have designed technology that allows them to go back into the past, and they capture the consciousness, the mind, of a person just at the moment they die, bring their consciousness through time, and transfer it into a body in their own timeline. The prototype was a man called Thomas Blaine, who was an architect in 1958. He has a car crash. They capture his mind, soul, or consciousness. They bring it through time and they place it into a new body. And most of the novel is actually about him coping with the fact that it's now 2110, which is obviously extremely weird for him. In the Get Back documentary, George actually describes the story quite differently, because the original novel was written at a different time and in a different country. It was based in America. George says that they focused in on a car on the M1. They made him crash so that he died. And then somehow they take his mind, or whatever it is, and transplant it into a new body. Now, there's an obvious Paul is dead reference here. I've often wondered whether how he describes it is exactly what happened, i.e. that the BBC took liberties with the original novel and made it more sort of British-centric, or whether they changed the nature of the story to make it more closely align with the Paul is dead story. And we can't check it, because that show's been deleted. It's so frustrating. Anyway, once Billy's turned up, and that's interesting, once Billy's turned up, because it's almost like he's the boss, George then plays a song that he wrote after watching TV last night. It's the first verse of I Me Mine. He's so incredibly defensive. I don't care if you don't want it, I don't give a fuck. And he has to say that because he knows that he gets maybe one song each side of the album, and that's his lot. I've never understood why they didn't allow him more songs on the albums, because it was a constant source of tension for him. He felt continually like he wasn't being listened to and he wasn't valued, because every album was, officially speaking, the John and Paul show. They have a little fun with the overhead mics that are there to pick up the conversations. And they do this sort of mock, we're going to be faced with a crisis chat for the sake of the microphones. And as they're standing there, you really see the difference in their height. Not just the height, but also the build. Billy is just not Paul. He is a taller, bigger man. And just occasionally, when people are actually standing upright next to each other, we do actually see the reverse shot when we see the full length of their bodies too. I just thought I'd put in the close-up for the video. Sometimes it is really obvious, the height difference and the build difference between Billy and John versus Paul and John. Billy's playing on the piano, he's working on Let It Be. John is drawing sketches of a stage made out of plastic. And Michael Lindsay Hogg goes over to Ringo and says, what is it that you actually want to do? What do you want to do for a TV show? What do you want to do for a concert? And in reference to Billy, Ringo says, see, I'd watch an hour of him just playing the piano. One of the things that always made Billy stand out for me, as a piano teacher myself, was the fact that Billy just played far too well. He's always played considerably better than Paul ever could. He even can improvise at the piano, which is actually a pretty damn hard skill. It's just another thing that points him out from Paul. Michael Lindsay Hogg has gathered the group together, and he's still trying to sell his ideas for the show, which are getting more and more grandiose by the moment. he still wants them to go abroad. He says that, well, possibly from the way that you're talking, this might be the last film you ever do, and so it's got to be good, but the documentary is running out of gas. He then says to John, Paul and you are not getting on as well as you did. And immediately John's face is just crestfallen. He's reminded that he's got to try to pretend that Billy is Paul. He's got to try and pretend that he gets on with him as well as he did the real Paul. And he knows in this moment he isn't pulling it off. He's also reminded how much he misses Paul and how things used to be. So as the group is pulled together and they're sitting around discussing ideas, Billy has the idea to play the Tower Ballroom like the Beatles used to do and just turn up, which I actually think is a really pretty cool idea. Wish they had done that. Michael Lindsay Hogg, however, thinks that the idea is too small in scope and says, but you're not the local dance band. He wants to go to Sabratha in North Africa and hire boats and take the audience with them. And George is immediately against it and says, no, I don't want to go abroad. At least I can go home from here and get away from it all. This is one of the reasons why I really like George, because he just can't help but spill the beans. That's the end of that day. We're now a week in. A whole week has passed, and they've achieved not really anything. So much for the supergroup. Here we are on Thursday the 9th of January. And again, more noodling, more mucking about. Billy's back at the piano, and Mal goes over to him and says, okay, where do you want to do the show? And he quips, a farm in Scotland. I thought this was really interesting because bear in mind the timeline. He's not actually married to Linda yet. He does not live in his Scottish farm yet. So what would be special about it? Later on, his farm in Scotland will become very important to him. But at this point, he doesn't spend time there. He's not married to Linda. They haven't had children. All of that stuff has yet to happen. So why did he mention it? Is it because he's thinking, albeit said in jest, that maybe the best place to have the concert is where Paul is buried, if indeed he is buried on the farm? And maybe from an occult point of view, that makes sense. Billy is working on The Long and Winding Road, and he's telling Mal the lyrics, and Mal is trying to help him with them. And then he says, it's sort of like The Wizard of Oz. And then he says, have you seen The Wizard of Oz? And Billy very quickly and very defensively says, no, I haven't. I just thought that was really interesting when we consider that The Wizard of Oz is used in mind control programming. Now, The Wizard of Oz came out in 1939. Bill was born in 1937. I suspect his deep mind control work must have happened in the first few years of his life. It's a possibility that it was used, although the timeline seems a bit iffy. But as an adult, he probably does know how that film is used. And his defensiveness was very interesting to me. So they carry on working and mucking about, and on this day they also work on Golden Slummers and Carry That Weight. Also on this day we get the first appearance of Linda in the studio. I suspect Billy was probably thinking, well, if everybody else can bring some outside people into the studio, so can I. And unlike them, Linda is at least useful because as a photographer she actually captures some really good photographs of this session. Then they carry on jamming. George is even on the drum kit at one point, and they actually come up with a couple of random songs, whole songs this day, namely Susie Parker and Commonwealth. But they are silly songs like Maggie May and Dig It. Eventually, they actually get down to doing something vaguely useful, and they start working on George's song For You Blue. Billy actually engages with him. Actually, I think for probably the first time. He isn't merely telling him what to do because it's George's song, and he does actually try to jam along with him. But it's a real effort for Billy to behave like Paul would behave with George. They then work on She Came In Through the Bathroom Window, And we get this odd comedy bit at the end where Billy says, "Hello, this is Tuesday speaking. Is that Paul?" And then he chuckles and says, "I'd like to have a word with you." And then John says, "I've got something of his in the garden." I always found this slightly chilling. I know he's joking, but many a true word is spoken in jest. Is it a reference to the fact that he's buried in the garden? And although we mostly assume that he is buried in the land on his Scottish farm, there is of course the possibility that he's actually buried in the garden of his London home, because Billy still owns both to this day, even though he doesn't really use either property that much. So that's the end of that day. Here we are, a week later, not much done. We move over to Friday the 10th of January, and Dick James turns up. He's talking about the acquisition of Northern Songs, which includes the Beatles songs. And he says that Vera Lynn has done covers of Good Night and Fool on the Hill, and that they're being put out as a single. And then it says, "Oh, she's doing them on the Rolf Harris show tomorrow night." I was quite surprised that they left this in, given what happened with Rolf Harris. The Beatles seem to be, I don't know, aligned with quite a few perverts. First Savile, now Harris. Also on this day, we also for the first time see Maureen Starkey, which is Ringo's wife. And so at this point, all four members of the Beatles have brought an outsider in. So now, in some sense, they're all as bad as each other. They're working on more songs. John and Billy are so wrapped up in each other trying to get a song down that they totally ignored George. And you can see the tension building on his face, and eventually he just gets up and says, "Right, I'm leaving the band now." As George leaves Twickenham, he tells his former bandmates, "See you around the clubs." And we even are treated to the diary entry that George made. Got up, went to Twickenham, rehearsed until lunchtime, left the Beatles, went home. It's almost comedically short. And after he leaves, rather than having the good sense to go after him, they just thrash about. They come back after lunch, they have Yoko wailing into a mic, and they're trying to get feedback off their amps. Neil Aspinall points out that George feels like he isn't heard and that he's always up against the John and Paul show. And John, very callously, I think, even though it is said as a joke, he says if he doesn't come back by Tuesday, we'll get Clapton. Toward the end of the first episode, and again at the beginning of the second episode of the Get Back documentary, we occasionally see these very small, maybe 2 or 3 second clips where the quality of the picture just suddenly goes and then comes back again. And it's like those little clips of film were artificially generated by AI. One of the things that AI is particularly bad at generating is good quality human hands. So you see in this picture that John's hand lacks all definition, and in fact everything looks sort of slightly plasticky. And I wondered whether these little clips of film were an attempt to patch up an original piece of 16mm film where that film had degraded. After George leaves, Ringo looks particularly depressed, and we are told that John, Paul, meaning Billy, and Ringo decide to meet with George, hoping to convince him to rejoin the band. Then we are told on Sunday, meaning the 12th of January, the 4 Beatles, along with Yoko and Linda, meet at Ringo's house. But the meeting does not go well. And that's the end of what they call Act 1, which is all of the section recorded at Twickenham Studios. I'm going to finish this section by reading a paragraph out of Mark Lewison's Complete Beatles Chronicle. This is how he describes the Beatles' time at Twickenham in January 1969. The most digestible of the Twickenham material was included in the Let It Be film. Much of the remainder was just too awful to be screened, showing the Beatles jamming more than 100 songs, sometimes just a line, sometimes an entire number. Dire performances which were mostly out of tune and time, and rarely played with any conviction, ranging from children's nursery rhymes like Bar Bar Black Sheep, to rock standards like All Shook Up, to Beatles oldies like Help, to future solo titles like All Things Must Pass, Backseat of My Car, Child of Nature, which becomes Jealous Guy, Every Night, Give Me Some Truth, Maybe I'm Amazed, That Would Be Something, to made-up-on-the-spot tunes, which, because of the film, had to be copyrighted, like Susie Parker, ascribed to Lennon, Starkey, Harrison, McCartney, Paul piano intro, credited to Lennon-McCartney, and jazz piano song, credited to McCartney-Starkey, to nonsense like Chopsticks, and even childhood radio memories like When Irish Eyes Are Smiling. As a 2-week exercise in sheer sloppiness, it was a good job. Mark used to work at Apple. In fact, he worked there for many years. And now they won't even talk to him. I wonder why. I had originally planned to put this video out as one continuous piece about the whole of the Get Back documentary, but since I'm already past the 50-minute mark, I'm going to put it out in 3 parts. So that's the end of the first part, and I hope to see you again for part 2. Thank you very much for watching, and goodbye.